Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Casual Criminalist. I'm your host Simon as always, and today joined by one of my writers, Emma. I mean, not joined by, but, virtually. She wrote the script for me. It's the Ypsilanti Ripper and the Michigan Murders. I've never read this before. We're going to read it together. I'm going to read it to you, dear audience member, and we're going to explore it together. I'm all over the place today. Let's just get into it. We're all fascinated by serial killers. You're here watching a channel about them, aren't you? So you would be. After all, you wouldn't be here if you preferred listening to period dramas where you did everyday things like cooking, cleaning, driving, or falling asleep. And yet, the odds of you ever coming across a serial killer are slim. You're far more likely to die in a car crash from a heart attack, malaria, or if you live in the US as a result of gun violence. Well, what if the serial killer was using gun violence, Emma? How about that? In 2020, 21,570 people were murdered in the United States, and it's estimated that 2% of those people were murdered by a serial killer. That's 431 people. But the estimated number of possible victims could be even less when you take into account that according to the Serial Killer Statistics Database, there are only 42 active serial killers in the US at this very moment. Honestly, that seems like a lot. That's kind of crazy. There could be dudes out there like Ted Bundy, and people we haven't even given a name to yet, like the Cut Your Face Off Slayer or whatever, that are just roaming around earning their nicknames. Which is just there's 42 of them, dude. That's like a room full of people. According to the Department of Social Studies and Humanities at Northeastern University, this is not only because we've learned to be better parents than our post-World War II counterparts, but also because we've become better at avoiding and identifying potential serial killers. Between 1970 and 1999, aka the golden age of serial killers, why would you call it the golden age history? Call it the nightmare time of serial killers. Why? Why do we have to give genius killer? Why do we have to give them cool names? There are an estimated 289 serial killers in the US. God damn! Back then, people were less aware of the dangers of these monsters. They slept with their doors and windows unlocked. Lovers picked secluded areas to park their cars while they fooled around, and young women gratefully accepted rides from strangers. And in the days and weeks following their disappearances, it would be hikers or joggers or their concerned neighbors who came across their mutilated bodies. But in 1969, when the 9-year-old Richard Ramirez started smoking weed and drinking alcohol, 5 years before Ted Bundy killed his first victim, and just 3 years before Ed Kemper became known as the co-ed killer, the female students living in the neighboring university towns of Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti in Michigan were more than aware that a serial killer was hunting them. But despite the police's tireless efforts to catch the man responsible, 8 women would die a brutal death before their killer was finally found and sent to prison. These are the stories of the 8 young women who will be forever known as the victims of the Michigan murders. Mary Flar. Mary Therese Flar, nicknamed Chi-Chi, was born on the 4th of December 1946 in Ypsilanti, Michigan, to Chester and Teresa Flar. Mary was one of 7 siblings and grew up surrounded by her extended family. They were originally from Poland, and her parents owned a farm outside of Willis. They're devout Catholics, and the entire family was actively involved in their local community. Mary loved the Beatles, played the piano, the acoustic guitar, and the bass drum in her school marching bands. Probably not all at once. She played I'm sure she played the bass drum, but the way it's phrased is she played the piano in the marching bands. It's a big thing to march around with. She had a weakness for shoes, wanted to become, I hope those were Bessie shoes, Mary, wanted to become a French interpreter, and in 1985 she started her studies in French and accounting at Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti. After being awarded a 4-year scholarship, she also started working part-time at the university registration office in McKinney Hall for a bit of extra cash. Mary's friends would later describe her as being confident and self-assured. Mary wasn't your typical party girl. She preferred to curl up on her bed and play guitar and was more than comfortable with her own company. She wore big rimmed glasses, didn't have many male friends, and as far as her parents knew, she hadn't been dating anyone in particular at the time. In June of 1967, Mary moved into an apartment in Ann Arbor with a friend of hers called Nancy Damascus. Later that same month, Mary, her sister Sheila, and 2 other girls took a trip to Montreal in Canada so that they could attend Expo 67, or the 1967 International and Universal Exposition. They spent a week there, and Mary bought her family several souvenirs and bought herself a silver commemorative Expo 67 medallion that she took to wearing on a chain around her neck. Wow, it sounds like she went to a festival, but she went to an exposition. This is the past. It's so wholesome. On the evening, we're talking about she's going to get murdered, so less wholesome than I just said, but you know what I mean. On the evening of Sunday, the 9th of July, 1967, Mary told her roommate Nancy DeMasalis that she was going for a walk, explaining that she needed to get out of the stuffy apartment. It has also been suggested that she wanted to give Nancy and her new boyfriend some privacy, so Mary grabbed her keys and headed outside. Yeah, she'll be like making out on the couch or whatever. And she's like, I'm just gonna get some fresh air. It's like, okay, see you guys later. Just wander around for like an hour. Their apartment was just across the street from the University of Michigan's campus building, and the tree-lined streets were broad, well-lit, and safe. So when Mary didn't return home that night, Nancy didn't think anything of it, thinking that Mary was probably visiting with her sister Sheila, who lived nearby. The next morning, at around 8 a.m., Nancy received a call from the registration office where Mary worked. Mary hadn't shown up for work, so Nancy called Sheila to ask if Mary had spent the night at her place. She hadn't. And when Nancy told Sheila that Mary hadn't returned home from her walk the previous night, Sheila immediately called their mother to let her know that Mary was missing. Mrs. Flar dropped everything and drove to the apartment that Mary had moved into just a few weeks earlier. At first glance, all of her belongings were still there, including her purse and driver's license. The only missing things were the outfit she'd been wearing the previous night, the silver Expo 67 medallion she wore around her neck, and her keys. Mrs. Flar called her husband from Mary's apartment and told him that Mary was missing, and together the two of them drove to the Ypsilanti police and reported their 19-year-old daughter missing that very same day. Now, this is usually where we explain that the police didn't take her disappearance seriously. And they didn't. Oh no, I thought this was going to be. But in this case, it's like, no, police being usually lazy as they are. Both Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti are university towns, and during the school year, the population explodes to over 50,000 people. It wasn't uncommon for concerned parents to call the police to let them know that their dear Sarah Ann or Mary Louise hadn't returned home that night, only for the girls in question to reappear days later, tired but happy, and no longer quite as innocent as their parents still considered them to be. Yeah, okay, I was too harsh on the police there. I feel this is I recorded an episode recently where basically the same thing happens, and the parents were like, oh no, not our girl. And the police are like, yeah, sure, yeah. Statistically, come on. So, despite Mr. and Mrs. Flar's insistence that Mary wasn't the kind of girl to stay out all night, the police reassured them that she would probably reappear within a day or two. But Mr. and Mrs. Flar continued to insist that something horrible must have happened to their daughter. And on the 12th of July, 1967, the Ypsilanti police finally filed a missing persons report for Mary. Detective Lieutenant Vern Howard was assigned the case and started his investigation by interviewing the Flars, Nancy, their neighbors, and anyone else who might have seen Mary that day. This enabled him to establish a timeline for the day when Mary had gone missing. That Sunday morning, Mary had attended Mass at St. John's Catholic Church in Ypsilanti. She went to work at McKinney Hall at around 7:30 a.m., where she helped with the registration for an upcoming cheerleading conference. At 5 that afternoon, she was supposed to meet up with her sister Sheila and two cousins at the nearby Silver Lake. But by the time she arrived, the state troopers were turning people away since the facilities were already full. Instead, Mary spent the next 2 hours on the beach at Half Moon Lake, where a friend saw her playing songs on her guitar for a group of children. Sheila and their cousins arrived at Mary and Nancy's apartment at around 7:30 p.m. to say hello and pick up a book, but Mary hadn't returned home yet, so the three of them left. Mary arrived home 10 minutes later, took a quick shower, got dressed into an orange polka dot dress with tan sandals, and then announced her intention to go for a walk at around 8:20 p.m. At least 3 people saw her walking around campus that night. One of them was a campus policeman who'd helped her out once when her car didn't want to start. The other two were Gerald and Nancy Durand, who lived a few houses down the street. Gerald Durand was a friend of Mary's uncle, and Mary would greet them whenever she passed by their house. Gerald would later tell the police that he and Nancy had been sitting on their porch when they saw Mary walking back to her apartment that night. They watched as a bluish-grey two-toned car pulled up alongside Mary. They saw that the young man driving the car leaned over the passenger seat and asked Mary something, but Mary shook her head and kept on walking. The young man then sped down the road and roughly pulled into a driveway, blocking Mary's path. Again, he leaned over the seat to ask her something, and again, Mary shook her head no and walked around the car. Frustrated, the young man pulled out of the driveway and his tires screeched as he drove away. Concerned, Gerald and his wife watched as Mary safely crossed the street and disappeared from view less than a block away from home. When Detective Sergeant Ronald Schoonmaker asked Kathy Jones, one of Mary's friends, if Mary would have gotten into a car with a strange man, the girl denied it, explaining that Mary was still shy around men and that she was, quote, a conservative Catholic who was just starting to feel comfortable with her femininity. Furthermore, Kathy had met Mary during a self-defense class on campus, and Mary was more than aware of the dangers of getting into cars with strange men. Yeah, and you're also way likely to get into a car It'd be like, you just blocked my path. You just screeched in front of me. You were following me. I'm not going to get into the car with you, you psycho. I wasn't going to get into the car when you seemed normal. On the 7th of August, 1967, Mary had been missing for a month when two 15-year-old boys came across a body on an abandoned farm just north of Ypsilanti. The boys had arrived on the farm to plough a cornfield that the Crowsman family leased and had been busy putting gas into the old tractor when they heard voices and a car door slammed shut just down the road. Since the old farmhouse and barn had been stood empty for years, the boys were on their way to see who it was when they heard the car drive away. And that's when they smelled the body lying in the tall grass near the old barn. At first, the boys thought that it was a dead animal, maybe a deer, since the body was larger than that of a dog. But when they took a closer look, they realized that the naked body definitely did not belong to a deer. So they drove to the police station in Ypsilanti to report it. Within an hour, the police had... Oh yeah, this is the past. I'm like, why didn't they just phone? It's the past. You gotta go tell people in person. Within an hour, the police had descended on the area and started their investigation. Dr. Henry J. Scoville, the assistant Washtenaw County medical examiner, confirmed that the body belonged to a young woman who had been dead for approximately 4 weeks. During a search of the surrounding area, the police determined that the woman's body had been moved at least twice after she had been murdered, suggesting that her killer had come back to see her. The initial dumping site was basically a rubbish dump since the area was littered with broken bottles and old rusted cans. They also found a pile of clothes that they determined must have belonged to her. Her underwear, a tan sandal, and an orange polka dot dress. The dress had been cut from the front and torn, and the pile of clothes had been hidden underneath some old cardboard boxes and building rubble. She'd only been there for a few days when she was first moved and left among some tall grass. Based on the stains, her body had been left there for at least 2 weeks before it was moved again, this time to the final dump site. On the 8th and 9th of August 1967, pathologists Dr. B. Naylor and Dr. Robert Hendricks performed her autopsy and found that she'd been stabbed 30 times in both the chest and abdomen with a knife or similarly sharp object. She had a slash on her back, which indicated that she'd been attacked from behind at some point and had been severely beaten before she died, and one of her forearms, the fingers on her remaining hand, and both of her feet were missing. They hadn't been cut off with a saw or a blade, and the pathologists didn't think that animals were to blame since it seemed like someone had used a blunt instrument to break her bones before they removed the missing body parts. Since her body was so badly decomposed, the police presented one of the tan sandals they'd found near the initial dumping site to Mr. and Mrs. Flar, who confirmed that it had indeed belonged to their daughter. Mary was then positively identified using her dental records, and her body was taken to the Moor Funeral Home for burial. This is a good way of doing things. You don't need the parents to identify the body when it's this badly decomposed. Just use the dental records. They should do this always for people who don't want to have to do this. Seems just like, I know it takes a little more work, but it's like, then you don't have to look at a dead body of someone you love. Which I guess is a little bit of a different thing in America because you got those open casket funerals, but I don't want to see a dead relative. The police had no leads to follow up on and no suspects to question, but shortly before Mary's funeral, the police received a call from the funeral home. According to Harold Britton, one of their employees, a young man had visited the funeral home and asked to see Mary's body, claiming that he was a friend of the family. When they told him that her casket was to remain closed during the funeral, he asked if it'd be permitted to take a photo of her body instead. What? Only later would Britton realize that the young man didn't have a camera with him. Bro, you what the dude? I'm assuming this guy's the murderer, right? But you already had the chance, dude. What the You wanting to get caught? Britton said no, but the young man was welcome to leave a message in the guest book. The young man left and Britton followed him, having marked the interaction as being weird as fuck. Good for you, my dude, you're on it. Britton saw the man drive off in a silver blue car, but he'd parked too far away for Britton to see the number plate or positively identify the make and model, but he thought it looked like a Chevrolet. But Britton did tell the police that Mr. Creep was a white male between 18 and 20 years old, about 5 foot 10 inches tall, and had a medium build. He wore a long-sleeve white shirt, black trousers, and loafer-style shoes. But when the Flazars were asked if his description rang a bell, they told the police that they didn't know anyone who fit that description. The police even went so far as to consult a clinical psychologist called Dr. Marks and asked him if he could provide them with any idea as to the kind of person that they were looking for. Fun fact, this was about 5 years before the FBI formed the Behavioral Science Unit and started studying serial killers. Anyway, Dr. Marks explained that their subject had a traumatic experience with a female, be it his mother, girlfriend, or wife. He could very easily be a person who is outwardly very religious. His religion is a defense mechanism against the emotions he has built up. The victim would be a symbol of someone whom the perpetrator wanted to get back at. He would not be a person who is outgoing when it comes to sex. The perpetrator would likely attack someone he does not know. This behavior frequently results from an irresistible impulse at the time. The fact that the victim's body was placed on a trash pile would be symbolic of the perpetrator thinking the female was trash, something to get rid of. This type of individual would tend to keep to himself and probably not get along well with neighbors. But in the days and weeks and months following Mary's funeral, the investigation into her death turned up no new leads, and eventually her case file was put aside, doomed to gather dust while other investigations took priority. Joan Elspeth Schell. Joan Elspeth Schell was born on the 1st of December 1947 in New Paris, Sheboygan County, Wisconsin, and her family would eventually move to Plymouth in Michigan, where she attended Plymouth High School. Joan met Dale Schultz in her senior year of high school, and the two started dating. Dale was a bad boy type, and Joan's parents did not approve of him. It also didn't help that the rebellious Dale was a year younger than Joan, and when he finished high school, Dale followed her to Eastern Michigan University, where Joan was now pursuing an art degree. Despite her parents' protests, Joan spent every minute she could with Dale. Then Dale dropped out the first year at EMU, got into trouble with the police for breaking and entering, and narrowly escaped going to prison by agreeing to join the army instead. No wonder her parents didn't approve of him. It sounds like they were bang on. After all, the Vietnam War was still going strong, and young men weren't exactly queuing up to fight on behalf of the great old US of A. But this meant that Dale wouldn't be able to see Joan as often as he liked. So in April 1967, he went AWOL so that he could go and see Joan in Plymouth. Dale was eventually found and dragged back to Fort Garden, Georgia. And that June, he went AWOL once again, traveling the 12.5 hours from Georgia to Ypsilanti by bus so that he could spend the weekend with Joan, to whom he secretly got engaged. Sweet as that is, this kind of behavior is only acceptable in romance novels. Yeah, going AWOL is gonna get you court-martialed, my dude. And when Dale went AWOL again on the 29th of June 1968, a warrant for his arrest was issued. Dale would go back to Ann Arbor, where he would move into an apartment with some of his friends who had agreed to hide him from the authorities. He now went by the name Jason Court, and would find work as a waiter at a restaurant. Joan and her friends had also agreed to do their best to ensure that Dale wasn't sent off to fight in Vietnam, and the two lovebirds look forward to spending the rest of their lives together as soon as he gets out of prison. While Dale was heading back to Ann Arbor, Joan's parents picked her up at her apartment in Ypsilanti, and she spent the weekends at home. On the afternoon of the 30th of June 1968, they took her back to Ypsilanti, where the family had dinner together before they dropped Joan off at the apartment she shared with her best friend, Susan Colber. Almost as soon as Joan set foot in her apartment, Susan told her that Dale had called to let her know that he was in Ann Arbor. Joan called him back and told Dale that she was going to catch the last bus to Ann Arbor so that she could see him. Joan quickly packed some things into a red burlap shoulder bag. Susan agreed to keep her company, and the two girls made their way to the nearest bus stop at around 10:30 p.m. The next bus to Ann Arbor only arrived at 11:15 p.m., but by the time it got to the bus stop and the two girls were waiting, the bus was already full, so the driver didn't stop. Frustrated, Joan told Susan that she'd hitchhiked to Ann Arbor if she had to, but come hell or high water, she would see Dale that night. Uh-oh, hitchhiking late at night. Oh, the Crash of Criminalist episode. Oh, you're gonna get murdered. I mean, we know this already, but Jesus. Shortly after, a red two-door coupe with a black top approached them, and Joan held out a hand asking for a lift. The car stopped next to the curb, and Susan noted that there were 3 men in the car. One of them asked Joan, "Do you want a ride?" And when Joan told them that she wanted to go to Ann Arbor, the 3 men agreed to take her. Grinning, Joan turned to Susan and promised, "I'll call you when I get to Ann Arbor." I feel like it'd be safer to get into a car with 3 random dudes as a woman than just one random dude, because one random dude can be a psycho. I feel like the chances of 3 random dudes all being into the same sort of horrible crimes is lower, right? Or am I just crazy? I mean, just don't do it in general. Don't do it. The driver's face was in shadow, but Susan watched as a tall man with dark brown hair and a medium build got out of the car and pulled his seat forward. Then Joan got into the back seat of the car and sat down next to a young man with blonde hair. The car pulled away, but instead of going down Washtenaw Avenue towards Ann Arbor, the car turned around and went back the way it came. Feeling uneasy, Susan went back to their apartment to wait for Joan's call. But when Dale called the apartment at 12:35 a.m. and asked her where Joan was, Susan had to tell him that Joan had gotten into a car with 3 strange men and should have been in Ann Arbor around midnight. God, it sounds bad when you retell it like that, doesn't it? Yeah, no, she got into a car with 3 strange dudes. Worried, Dale told Susan to call the police, and then he and some of his friends went hunting through the streets of both Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti looking for a red and black car. Meanwhile, Susan was giving her statement to the Ypsilanti police and described the two men she did see to a sketch artist. These sketches would later be released to the media and were plastered all over EMU's campus. Susan told the police that she thought the car was a Pontiac and that it had 3 square tail lights on each side. Another witness had seen the 3 men earlier that night inside the McKinney Hall building and would later tell the police that the car was a Pontiac Bonneville. But 2 other witnesses would tell the police that the car had been a Ford Fairline, and after Googling these 2 cars, I confirmed that they look remarkably similar, especially if the Pontiac had been a 1965 model. So, I didn't mention it, but Emma had included 2 pictures of a car for me here, and I'm like, wait, why'd you include the same picture twice? But they're different cars. They look very, very similar, especially like someone who's not super familiar with car models from this period. Like, they are very similar looking cars. The ESU campus police started interviewing every male student that matched the descriptions provided by Susan, and the Michigan State Police eventually tracked down 150 red and black coupes in an attempt to find the 3 men. But it was too late to save Joan. Her body was discovered by 2 construction workers on a site on the outskirts of Ann Arbor just 5 days after she'd disappeared. Her body was taken to the University of Michigan's hospital morgue, and once again, Dr. Robert Hendricks would do an autopsy on the body. He found that the 20-year-old Joan had been stabbed a total of 24 times. Just like Mary, she had fought for her life and had done her best to get away from her attacker, resulting in her sustaining 3 stab wounds in the back, 1 to the left side of her neck, which had severed her carotid artery, 1 underneath her left ear, and 1 to the back of her neck. She'd also been strangled when her attacker had wrapped her miniskirt around her neck, and Dr. Hendricks determined that she'd also been sexually assaulted at some point during the attack. Dr. Hendricks speculated that the murder weapon had been a hunting knife and that her killer had taken the time to clean her body after she'd passed away. Her body had been kept in a building for 4 days before it was taken to the empty field, where it would be discovered a day later. While searching the area, the police also came across Joan's clothes, but they did not find the red shoulder bag that she'd packed that night. According to Susan, the bag had included a change of clothes, her makeup, purse, and student ID. Of course, it hadn't taken the police long to identify Dale Schulz as a possible suspect. After all, Joan's parents had no problem telling the police that they hadn't approved of his relationship with their daughter, and then there was his past run-ins with the law and the warrant currently out for his arrest. He was taken into the Ypsilanti police's custody just 2 hours after Joan's body had been found, and the detectives had to break the news to him that his fiancée was dead. According to one of the detectives who interviewed him, quote, "He was pretty shaken by it. He said he couldn't believe it. He wept." Yeah, I mean, it's like a very ordinary reaction. Following his interrogation, the police no longer considered him to be a suspect, but they still wanted him to undergo a polygraph test. Oh my god. I feel like the last 3 episodes that I've made on this, or recorded, I don't know if they've come out yet, have involved polygraph tests, and I'm always like, because they're not reliable. The military police agreed, and once Dale passed his polygraph test on the 5th of August 1968, he was arrested for desertion. But representatives from the Michigan State Police, the Ypsilanti Police Department, and the Ann Arbor Police had already met to discuss the similarities between Joan Schell's murder and the murder of 19-year-old Mary Flar. The girls had also lived just a few blocks from each other, worked in the same building, and were both petite brunettes. But the decision was made to treat the 2 murders as separate incidents for now, and the police continued to follow up on every possible lead they could. Seems very sensible. Treat them as separate, treat them as possibly linked. But for now, separate. One of the most promising leads had made itself known just 2 weeks after Joan's body had been discovered. A man who'd worked in the same building as both Mary and Joan told the police that a colleague of his named John Collins was taunting a female staff member with graphic descriptions of what had happened to Joan. Bro. The police questioned John and asked him how he knew so much about the case. John explained that his uncle was a state trooper and he'd heard them discuss the case. His uncle, Corporal Daniel Lake, denied discussing the case with his nephew, but explained that John had friends in the police force and that he often hung out with them at the Bomber restaurant. It was possible that he had heard the information from them. Not only that, but John hadn't been in Ypsilanti when Joan had disappeared. He'd been visiting his mother in Centerline in Detroit that weekend. I assume there'd be paperwork to back that up, so we know it's not him. On the 18th of August 1968, the media reported that the police had run out of leads, despite numerous businesses raising a reward of $12,000 in exchange for any information that may lead to the arrest of Joan's murderer. Jane Mixer. Jane Louise Mixer was born on the 23rd of February 1946 in Muskegon, Michigan, to Daniel and Marion Mixer. Jane had an older sister and a brother, and according to her niece Maggie Nelson, Jane and her sister Barb didn't always get along. In the book she wrote about her aunt and the impact her murder had on the family, Maggie writes, "Jane was a gusher," my mother says. "You know, a gusher. I really like your dress, I really do. I mean, it's adorable. Really and truly adorable." In high school, the bubbly Jane was a part of the Booster Club, the varsity cheerleading squad, and was very opinionated when it came to politics. This resulted in a lot of arguments between her and her more conservative parents, and when Jane left for the University of Michigan, it was to pursue a law degree. Jane spent some time studying in France, backpacked through Europe, and when she returned to the US, she became a political activist. In 1968, she fell in love with one of her lecturers, a graduate student named Phil Weitzman, who would later explain that it had fallen for her, quote, intellect, her intense curiosity, her budding sensitivity to social issues, her ambition, and much later to her physical attributes. The two of them quietly got engaged in March 1969, and an excited Jane called her parents in Muskegon to tell them the good news and that she was planning on going home that weekend to visit them. Unfortunately, Phil wouldn't be able to join her, and since Jane didn't have a car of her own, she made her way to the basement of the Student Union building and put up a note on the notice board letting other students know that she needed a ride home that weekend. According to Phil, it read, "Ride wanted to Muskegon Thursday. Call Jane." It included both her phone number and her home address. A man named David Johnson replied to her note and arranged to meet her on the Law Quad at around 6:30 p.m. on the 20th of March. At 6:15, Phil called the phone in the Law Quad to check if she'd already left, and she told him that she was still waiting. When he phoned again at 7 p.m., no one answered the phone. Jane was supposed to arrive at Muskegon around 9:30 that night. When she still wasn't home by 10, Dan Mixer called the Michigan State Police to let them know that his daughter was missing. Both Dan and Marion were out of their minds with worry, so Dan drove all the way to Ann Arbor and back to see if Jane had been involved in a car accident. According to Dan, he was just looking, trying to see something. By morning, both the state police and Muskegon's sheriff department were searching the highway for any clues as to what had happened to Jane, but they had no idea that they were looking in the wrong place. 13-year-old Mark Groh was walking to the bus stop along Denton Road in Van Buren Charter Township, just east of Ypsilanti, when he came across a shopping bag. The bag was just sitting on the side of the road outside of the Denton Township Cemetery, and thinking that someone must be looking for it, Mark turns back home and showed the bag to his mother, Nancy Ann Groh. Nancy told Mark to hurry back to the bus stop or he'd be late for school, and then she took out the contents of the bag. Inside, she found what looked like a wrapped birthday present, a birthday card, some books, and typed reports. But at the bottom of the bag, she also noticed something that looked like blood. Instead of calling the police, like any sensible person should, Nancy then got into her car and drove to the cemetery. There, 100 feet inside the cemetery itself, she saw the body of a dark-haired woman lying on one of the graves. The body was mostly covered with a yellow nylon raincoat, but it was obvious that the woman was dead, so Nancy jumped into her car and raced to her sister's house. She told her sister what she'd seen, and the two of them called the police. State troopers, detectives from the Ypsilanti Police Department, and deputies from the Wayne County Sheriff's Department arrived within an hour. They took photos of the scene and removed the raincoat from the body. She was still fully dressed, but her skirt had been pushed up to her waist and her pantyhose had been pulled down. Her underwear hadn't been touched, and based on the fact that her killer had left her menstrual pad in place, they determined that she hadn't been sexually assaulted. This would later be confirmed during the autopsy. Next to her, the police found a copy of the book Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. Great book. Inside the cover, someone had written, Philip Weitzman. It was the state troopers who initially identified the body as belonging to Jane Mixer, and later that same day, a trooper would knock on the door of the Mixer house in Muskegon to let Dan know that he and Marion were needed in Ann Arbor. Phil was interviewed by two detectives and he told them what he knew. He also told the police that he was aware that Jane's parents didn't approve of him. Not only was he Jewish, but he was also a liberal, and the Mixers were Lutheran and conservative. Still, that didn't matter to Jane, who'd already put in a request to transfer to either Columbia or New York Law School since Phil had accepted a professor's post at a university in the East. Then the police told Phil that Jane had been murdered, and he insisted on calling her himself several times before accepting the fact that she would never again answer the phone when he called. On his way home from school at around 3 p.m. that day, Mark listened as the bus driver explained that someone had found a body in a nearby cemetery. Thinking that it had to have something to do with the bag he'd found that morning, Mark kept an eye on his surroundings as he walked home and spotted what he thought were some drag marks that led from the other side of the road into the cemetery. When Mark got home, the police were still talking to his parents, and he reported what he'd seen. Mark and Nancy weren't the only ones with information. Jack Groh had also some news to share. He told the police that he'd been working in his garage late the previous night when he saw a cream-colored station wagon drive past the house. The vehicle drove into the cemetery, did a loop, came to a stop, and then left again around midnight. He hadn't thought anything of it until his wife called him at work to tell him about the body in the cemetery. Dan and Marion identified Jane's body on the 22nd of March 1969, and that afternoon Dr. Robert Hendricks did her autopsy. He established that the 23-year-old had died between midnight and 3 a.m. on the morning of the 21st of March 1969. She had been shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber handgun. The killer had also tied a cinnamon-colored nylon stocking around her neck and had tied it with a granny knot. Soap granules that were found on her clothes indicated that she'd been taken to a house or an apartment building where she was kept in a laundry room for up to 4 hours before she died. On the 24th of March, 1969, the Ann Arbor News reported on Jane's murder and linked it to the murders of Mary Flazon and Joan Schell, despite the fact that the only similarities between their cases was the color of their hair. Her father, meanwhile, was constantly calling up his friends in the police, offering up new leads and begging them to find out who had murdered his daughter. At first, he accused Phil of murdering Jane, then one of Phil's ex-girlfriends. He told the police that someone must have paid someone to kill Jane, then settled on the theory that Jane must have known the person who'd murdered her. But eventually, even Dan Mixer had to accept the fact that Jane was gone and nothing he did was going to bring her back. Quoting, "Newspapers tend to dwell on the tragedies of the world. There comes a time when you have to say to yourself that the tragedy's taken place. You can dwell on it, or you can go on with your life." Marilyn Skelton. Marilyn Skelton was born in Wayne County, Michigan, on the 4th of March 1953 to Archie and Helen Skelton. They lived in Romulus, Detroit, and she had a brother named Thomas and a sister named Barbara. They weren't the perfect family. Archie Skelton would regularly beat his wife and often threatened his children with violence, and they all knew to stay out of his way when he was in a rage. In 1968, Marilyn was a freshman at Romulus High School and soon befriended a girl named Sharon Sanders. She would spend her weekends at Sharon's house, but Helen liked Sharon, so she didn't have much of an issue with her daughter spending so much time there. But then Marilyn started lying about what she was doing and where she was going, and she started running away from home. Marilyn and Sharon would spend their time at an apartment in Ann Arbor that the police referred to as a hippie crash pad, and it was during this time that Marilyn became addicted to drugs. It was the school officials who realized that all was not well with Marilyn, and they called the West County Police, asking them to send someone to meet with a 15-year-old drug addict. That's when Wayne County Police Officer Beverly Scannell met Marilyn, and she would later explain that, quoting, "Marilyn tried it all, marijuana, speed, heroin, and LSD. Miss Skelton was all over Wayne County, buying and selling drugs to support her habit. After being picked up in Westland on a drug charge, Marilyn became a police informant to mitigate her situation." Officer Scannell went to meet Marilyn's parents and told them what her daughter had been up to, but would later explain that they didn't believe her. So on the 28th of January 1969, Marilyn was admitted to hospital after she overdosed on heroin, and Archie and Helen Skelton had to face up to the fact that their 15-year-old daughter was a drug addict. Helen told anyone who'd listened that Marilyn had just had too many flu shots, but she had to sit and watch as Marilyn's hippie friends came to visit her in the hospital. This included the 17-year-old Sharon, who was now Mrs. Santucci. Her husband, John, would proudly proclaim himself to be the king of the hippies, and Marilyn also had a 19-year-old boyfriend called Mike Millage. Horrified, the Skeltons decided that they had to get Marilyn away from her hippie friend, so they bought a house in Flint and spent the entirety of March traveling between Romulus and Flint. But the now 16-year-old Marilyn didn't plan on moving to Flint and told her parents that she was going to marry Mike. This led to several shouting matches between Marilyn and her father, and on the 16th of March, Marilyn ran away from home. She returned to Flint on the 19th of March and told Helen that she'd been living with Sharon. While visiting her family, Marilyn received a call from her boyfriend Mike, who told her that her dealer was looking for her and that she'd better show up in Ypsilanti with the money or they'd kill her. Panicked, Marilyn offered to sell her bicycle and typewriter to her mother, who handed her $34 to pay off her debts. On the 21st of March, the family finished moving to Flint, and Marilyn helped her father load the U-Haul. That afternoon at around 1 p.m., Marilyn told her father that she wanted a ride to Ypsilanti and that she needed another $10 to pay off her debts. This resulted in a screaming match between the two of them, and in the end, her brother Thomas and his friend Larry Klinsky told Marilyn that they'd give her a lift. We offered to take Marilyn wherever she needed to go, but she said she was going to call her friend and pick her up. Thomas and Giles dropped Marilyn off at the Standard Station in Ann Arbor. From there, she called Sharon around 4 p.m. to ask her to come and pick her up at the McKinney Student Union building on the EMU campus. Sharon told her that she didn't have the car and asked if she would be able to make it on her own to Ypsilanti instead. Marilyn said that she'd hitch a ride with someone and told her friend that she'd see her soon. But when Marilyn didn't arrive, Sharon grew worried. Jane Mix's body had been found just that morning, and a panicked Sharon immediately called Ypsilanti police to let them know that Marilyn was missing. But when the officer on duty learned that Sharon wasn't a relative of Marilyn's, he told Sharon that he couldn't open a missing persons report without the approval of Marilyn's parents. That evening, Both Sharon and Mike Millage went out to Ypsilanti State Police to report Marilyn as missing. Once again, they told the police that they couldn't open a missing persons case because they weren't related to Marilyn. Frustrated, Mike called Helen Skelton and told her that Marilyn was missing. When Helen reassured him that it's not the first time that Marilyn had run away and that she'd reappear any day now, Mike yelled at her and said, "What are you going to do? Wait until she's found with 3 bullet holes in her head?" He called Helen several times that night to demand that she file a missing persons report and ended up filing his own with Wayne County Sheriff's Department that same day, but his constant calls had the desired effect. Shortly after midnight on the 24th of March, Archie and Helen went to the Ypsilanti police headquarters and reported Marilyn as missing. Wait, I thought they said that he couldn't file it because he wasn't related to her. Later that same day, Helen waited until Archie had left for work before she went back to the Ypsilanti State Troopers and told Corporal Chiachetto that it wasn't the first time that Marilyn had run away. She didn't know why Mike was so worried about his 16-year-old missing girlfriend and told Corporal Chiachetto to get in contact with Officer Beverly Scannell from the Wayne County Sheriff's Department if he wanted more information about Marilyn's history. At 11 a.m. the next morning, a man called Alan Rentschler called the Ann Arbor Police Department to let them know that they'd found a body. Within 10 minutes, the area was swarming with police and crime scene investigators. And brace yourself, Simon, because it's not pretty. Okay. The young girl's body was lying next to a newly constructed house on a building site. She was naked, and a piece of blue cloth had been shoved in her mouth to keep her from screaming. A garter belt had been tied around her neck, and she was lying on her back with her legs open and bent in what police referred to as a R-word position. She had suffered numerous brutal blows to her head that had caved a part of her skull in, and she had numerous bruises to her chest, abdomen, and thighs. Worse still, she'd been molested with a tree branch that measured 11 inches and had been left inside her body. Ann Arbor Police Chief Walter E. Krasny would later tell reporters, quote, "This is the worst thing I've seen in 30 years of police work. We can't say this has no connection with the other 3 murders. There almost has to be some link." Thanks to the missing persons report that had been filed a day earlier, the police were able to identify the body as belonging to 60-year-old Marilyn Skelton. Her body was then taken to the University of Michigan's hospital morgue, and Officer Beverly Scannell was the one who identified her. She also had to inform both Archie and Helen that Marilyn was dead. Dr. Robert Hendricks and Dr. Paul Gickus performed her autopsy and confirmed that she'd been sexually assaulted, though they were unable to find any semen in her body. They also determined that she'd died as a result of the repeated blows to her head. Later tests would determine that the murder weapon had been a tree branch. The bruises on her body were the result of someone repeatedly beating her with a belt. Dr. Hendricks speculated that Marilyn had been alive until the 24th of March when she was walked to the area where her body was found. She was then stripped of her clothes and assaulted, and her body left there overnight before being found the next morning. She hadn't been stabbed like Mary and Joan had been. Her body had also not been kept for days before being discarded next to the road. She hadn't been shot like Jane had been, and unlike Jane, Marilyn had been stripped of her clothes, just like Mary and Joan. Not only that, but she was significantly younger than the previous 3 victims, and not for the first time, the police wondered if they were dealing with more than one killer. The only viable suspect in Marianne's murder was her father, Archie Skelton. Their old neighbors in Romulus all told the police that both Archie and Helen were heavy drinkers, and Archie was known to have been abusive towards his daughters. He used to hit them with his belt to discipline them, and his neighbors had seen him burn the furniture he'd broken during a drunken rage. Marilyn's teachers explained that they'd all known that the Skelton girls were being abused and that their elder sister Barbara had run away from home. Marilyn had also told the school counselor that she was planning on doing the same and was planning on getting married to her boyfriend, Mike, who she worshipped. It's like, don't fuck up your kids. Reason Marianne is involved with how old was he? 19 years old, using heroin and shit. It's because her parents are, just not good. They're just not good. Kids who went to school with her all explained that they knew she'd been dealing drugs at school, but it was her best friend Sharon who shared the most interesting piece of information, quoting, "Marilyn was a 3rd-degree red belt karate expert, and she was pretty good. Mike charged her with a knife once as a test, and she threw him to the ground, almost breaking his wrist. I imagine whoever attacked her was pretty big or had a weapon of some kind." Both Helen and Archie had to go undergo polygraph tests, and they both admitted to being home on the afternoon of the 21st. Archie denied knowing how Marilyn got to Ann Arbor and denied killing her. The polygraph technician told the investigators that Archie Skelton was a bully and a liar, but that he'd been truthful when he explained that he hadn't murdered his daughter. Soon, the media started referring to the string of unsolved murders as the Michigan murders. In the days following Marianne's death, Washtenaw County prosecutor William Delly formed a task force that was dedicated to investigating these murders. The task force consisted of members of each of the 5 police departments working on the case, and they were based out of the Holy Ghost Fathers Catholic Seminary halfway between Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti. They were led by Captain Dan Meyer and met up once a week to discuss their notes and any new leads that they had. But unbeknownst to them, the man who would become known as the Ypsilanti Ripper was just warming up. Dawn Bassam. Dawn Louise Bassam was born on the 28th of November, 1955 in Ypsilanti to Louis and Cleo May Bassam, and was the youngest of 4 children. Her father passed away when Dawn was 9, and Cleo continued to raise her 4 children on her own. In 1969, their eldest 2 daughters had already moved out of the house, and the 14-year-old Louis Jr. and 13-year-old Dawn had run of the house. Their neighbors had explained that Dawn was a tomboy who'd often play in the front yard with her brother, and the 2 of them would wave at passing cars. Harold Goodman, the principal at West Junior High in Ypsilanti, explained that Dawn was an average to good student with a happy disposition, and her friends told reporters that, quote, Dawn had many friends and was popular in school. She had a unique bedroom decorated unlike any I had ever seen. The walls had huge decals of guitars and record album covers stapled everywhere. Dawn's mum let kids come over to the house to listen to music. Dawn had lots of samba parties. Dawn loved to dance and was a sweet 13-year-old girl who looked older than she was. The quote ends. In April, Dawn dyed her light brown hair strawberry blonde. When the 17-year-old Karen Stapleton saw Dawn hitchhiking just 2 weeks after Marilyn Skelton's body had been found, she scolded her for being irresponsible. They all knew there was a serial killer on the loose, and the young women in both Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor were being extra cautious. According to Karen, Dawn had scoffed at her warning and told her, "He's only killing brunettes. I'm blonde now." At 5 p.m. on the 15th of April 1969, the 13-year-old Dawn left home to meet up with some friends in a rundown part of Ypsilanti called Depot Town. She was wearing plastic pearl earrings, a white plastic jacket, a white cotton blouse, an orange wool sweater, and blue nylon stretch pants. Dawn's brother-in-law dropped her off, and she met up with some friends and her new love interest, the 17-year-old Earl Kidd. Bruh. 13 and 17? Bruh. At around 6 p.m., Earl started walking Dawn home, but the 2 of them went their separate ways at one point because Dawn didn't want her mum to realize that Earl was so much older than she was. Several people saw her hurrying towards home, including 2 of her classmates and a train enthusiast who'd been timing the arrival of the Wolverine, a passenger train, at the train station on Railway Street. He told the police that the train arrived on time at 7:25 p.m. and had been at the station until 7:35 p.m., the last time Dawn was seen alive. She'd been just 150 yards away from being home and safe. When Dawn wasn't home by 8 p.m., Cleo started calling all of Dawn's friends to ask if anyone knew where she was. In a panic, she reported Dawn as officially missing shortly before midnight. Her body was discovered at 6:30 a.m. the next morning, 5 miles north of her home. She was positively identified by Deputy William Mulholland, who explained that his daughter was friends with Dawn. Her body had been left at the side of the road. Her clothing had been torn, and she was naked from her shoulders down. A white cloth had been shoved into her mouth to keep her from screaming, and she'd been sexually assaulted. Her killer had also wrapped a piece of electrical cord around her neck to strangle her and stabbed her 7 times, and there were multiple gashes cut into her chest and abdomen. She'd died of strangulation. The police found one of her shoes farther down the road and suspected that she'd been killed somewhere else. For the next 3 hours, the police scoured the area and came across Dawn's orange sweater outside a deserted farmhouse a mile from her home. Inside a dilapidated barn, the police found another piece of electrical wire, blue underwear that didn't belong to Dawn, and another piece of white cloth from her blouse. Inside the basement of the farmhouse, they found some buttons that had been torn from her blouse, blue and red wool fibers that didn't come from Dawn's clothing, some fingerprints that didn't belong to Dawn, and a wad of tissues with dried semen on them. Tests showed that the semen belonged to a male with type O blood. So this is like what they did pre-DNA. They could break things down by blood type. So it was an indicator, but not conclusive. The police speculated that Dawn's abductor had taken her to the basement of the old farmhouse where the attack began. But Dawn had somehow managed to escape the barn, where her attacker then murdered her. The police patrolled the area where Dawn had been murdered, and the day after her body was found, 2 officers called into the station to let their supervisors know that the killer had come back. They hadn't seen him, but had left behind 2 items that once belonged to Dawn, one of her pearl earrings and a piece of her blouse. A month after the police had discovered Dawn's body, the barn was set ablaze. 3 men would be arrested on arson charges, and they admitted that it was just a bit of drunken fun. As the forensic reports relating to Dawn's murder started to come in, the task force met to discuss the murders. The Ann Arbor News would report that one of the police officers on the task force told them that the investigation into the now infamous Michigan murders felt like a living nightmare, quoting, "I feel like I'm sitting in a movie I've seen 3 times before, and the ending is disappointing every time." Despite the detailed forensic evidence and multiple witness statements they'd been able to gather, the police had no viable leads. and the Ann Arbor News reported that Prosecutor Delhi might have been considering granting immunity from prosecution to anyone who could provide them with information about the killer. According to Delhi, someone in this area knows the killer, perhaps was with him at the time of the slayings. That person can help us catch the murderer and could save someone's life if he'll just give us a call. They reported that the reward for information regarding the case was now up to $30,000. That's going to be like $300K today. This was like the 60s. And the Freelance Star reported that women all over Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor were taking precautions like arming themselves with switchblades and a newly invented self-defense product called mace. There you go, that became a thing. Quoting, most co-eds said that they adopted a buddy system of walking either with a male friend or with at least 3 others when venturing out at night. On the day of Dawn's funeral, Sandra Flazar, Mary Flazar's younger sister, wrote a letter that would be published in the Ypsilanti Press. It read, "Have you ever walked from class on campus without looking over your shoulder for fear of someone watching you? I haven't. Have you ever had a stranger smile at you and want to smile back, but have been afraid to? I have. Have you ever driven down Geddes Road without shedding a tear? I haven't. I am the sister of one of the victims of the brutal, perverted murders that have taken place in this community within the last 2 years. My sister was the first, whose sister will be the last." Many of you will read this letter and pass it off by consoling yourself with, "It can never happen to me." But I believe that after 5 of these slayings, it should be obvious that the murderers have no respect for persons and that any one of you could be next. I think it is time for the people of this community to exercise their rights as citizens and do their part to see that justice is brought about. I am therefore making a personal appeal, not only for myself, but for all young girls who are forced to live in this constant fear for our very lives. The appeal being that you, the public, come forth with any information you may have, which in some way may be relevant to these murders. And Sandra's appeal worked. Over 800 tips were called in, with women offering up their boyfriends and husbands as suspects. Over 1,000 convicted. If you're offering up your boyfriend or husband as someone who could potentially murder someone, I don't think that relationship is very long for this world. It's like, oh no, my boyfriend could be like the sexual assaulter murderer. Yeah, he could be. He could be. And he's not. But it's like, god damn your relationship. Over 1,000 convicted sex offenders were questioned and eliminated as suspects, and thousands of men were questioned and placed under observation, which included at least 2 police officers. They were both later cleared of any suspicion. Alice Colon. Alice Elizabeth Colon was born on the 25th of December, 1947 in Middlebury, Indiana, and grew up in Kalamazoo, Michigan. In her admissions essay, she explained that her father, Joseph, was a Russian Jew that had owned a small grocery store in town. Alice used to help out at the store as a child and explained that her father had often been faced with discrimination from people in town, yet he taught her to treat everyone as her equals. Quote, "My father impressed upon me that there were good and bad members of any racial group. He really practiced the policy of trusting a man until he proved you wrong and then giving him a second chance." It's a good policy. Alice explained that it was his teachings that made her want to pursue a career as a social worker, and so she applied to the University of Michigan School of Social Work after obtaining a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in May 1969. She lived in an apartment not far from campus and was described as being serious, likable, conscientious, and quiet. She had an interest in photography and was taking an additional photography course that summer, and her landlord explained that his only complaint was that she used too much water when she was developing her photos. A friend of hers, Ben Cullaghy, would later explain that they were working on a photo essay on the old farmhouses and barns in the surrounding area. During those 3 months, they'd probably visited every abandoned farm in the area, and the 2 of them had grown close, quoting, "We were taking photos at an abandoned farmhouse off Pontiac Trail. Hanging from the ceiling was a length of electrical cord, looped at one end like a noose. Alice placed her head inside and asked me to take the photo. She thought it would make a great gag shot." Alice had converted her closet into a darkroom, and the 2 would spend entire afternoons developing their photos there. They were busy developing their photos on the 7th of June 1969, when the 21-year-old Alice went missing. Quoting again, "I went to Alice's apartment on Saturday night. She left prints floating in the rinse water, with the images getting damaged. I hung the prints up and waited for her to come home. At 11 a.m. on Sunday, I called the Ann Arbor police to report Alice missing when she didn't come home all night." Alice's neighbors reported that they'd seen her sitting on the porch that afternoon talking to a friend. That evening, she left home to attend to another friend's birthday party at the Depot House, a converted train station that now acted as a venue for local bands. Alice had been dressed in a purple blouse, a white miniskirt, pantyhose, brown loafers, and a distinctive multicolored horizontal striped raincoat. She wore long, dangly earrings and a headband and had her contacts in. She also carried a bag with her that contained a pair of purple shoes that she bought earlier that day and planned to wear to the party. No one is sure whether Alice made it to the party. One eyewitness reported seeing Alex kissing a tall, dark-haired guy with a beard and a mustache before leaving the party in a red Volkswagen at around 3 a.m. on Sunday, but no one else could corroborate her story. The next day, 3 teenage boys came across a partially clothed body that had been left at the side of the road near an abandoned farm. The woman was still wearing a multicolored striped raincoat, but her purple blouse, her bra, and her underwear had all been cut from her body and shoved aside. Her miniskirt was found nearby. The body was taken to the University of Michigan's hospital morgue, and Dr. Hendricks did her autopsy. He determined that the woman had been stabbed at least 4 times in her neck and chest, but her cause of death was the result of 2 gunshot wounds to her head that came from a .22 caliber handgun. A wound on her right thumb indicated that she'd tried to keep her attacker from shooting her. Dr. Hendricks confirmed that she'd been sexually assaulted at some point during the attack, and her attacker had used her miniskirt to clean himself up. Her body had been moved at some point after her death, and investigators would later determine that she'd been murdered just a short drive down the road near the entranceway to the Washtenaw Sand and Gravel Company's driveway. Ben Collegy was the one who identified her, quoting him, "The vision of Alice, dead on the slab, is something I will never forget. I identified her, and the cop said to the morgue tech, 'Go tag her,' and coldly walked away. The police held me overnight, and different police departments took turns interrogating me in teams." The police searched Alice's apartment and came across the photo of Alice standing with what looked like a noose around her neck. Again, Ben was called in for questioning, and again he had to repeat the same story to police. The police had no decency or politeness and asked overly personal questions about our sexual relationship. I was harassed so badly, I wished I had ever known Alice. Someone leaked my name to the press. I lost a lot of friends over the media mess. God, that sucks. Assuming this guy's got nothing to do with it, which I think we can. That sucks. Alice's parents also travelled to Ann Arbor, and they were swamped by the media, who wanted to know if they were there to collect their daughter's body. A grieving Joseph Callum famously shouted at the cameras, "I don't want her body, I want her alive. I didn't come here for her body. I'm not going to claim her body. I'm going to tell other girls not to go to this university. It's too big. They don't care about anything but money and politics. I'm not going to bury her. Let them bury her on the president's lawn. I worked too damn hard to raise her, to send her here. I don't want her dead." Alice was buried in Kalamazoo, and in the weeks following her death, her name was added to the list of unsolved murders attributed to the Ypsilanti Ripper. The Psychic. In the days following Alice's murder, the people of Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti were growing more and more desperate for the constant nightmare to end, and one particular group decided there was only so much praying that a person can do. So Mr. and Mrs. Allen got together a group of concerned citizens who were all anxious to bring this murdering to an end and called in the help of a psychic. Oh, God. Okay. Their hero would be the 58-year-old Peter Herkos, a self-proclaimed psychic medium from the Netherlands who liked to dabble in murder investigations. Herkos claimed that he'd manifested the ability to use ESP, or extrasensory perception, after he fell off a ladder and ended up in a coma. He then moved to Los Angeles and used this newfound skill to make a new career for himself as a celebrity psychic. Herkos would later claim that he'd been part of both the investigation into the Boston Strangler case and the investigation into actress Sharon Tate's murder, when in actuality he had just shown up and demanded to provide a reading for the police. Attorney General Edward W. Brooke reportedly explained that Herkos' description of the Boston Strangler was uncannily close to the description they'd received from witnesses. When Herkos visited Sharon Tate's murder scene, he told the police that Tate had been murdered as part of a, quote, black magic ritual known as a Guna Guna. Of course, we know that Charles Manson and his followers would later be found guilty of a murder, after which Herkos would later claim that he'd been the one to give Manson's name to the police. Herkos would also insist that the man the police suspected of being the Boston Strangler, aka Albert DeSalvo, was innocent. DNA tests would later link DeSalvo to at least one of the murders. Oh God, psychics kill me, man. Just complete waste of space. Stop it.
What is it, Derek? You alright?
Mary loves Dick. Mary loves Dick. Mary loves Dick.
And despite claiming that had been integral to solving 27 criminal cases in 17 countries, no one supported his claims, saying that he just hung around and waffled on without actually being useful in solving the case. Besides, all of the leads he so happily provided the police with were all taken from media reports on the cases that he was investigating. Anyway, Herkos wanted $2,500 in exchange for providing his services, which is about $21,350 today. Good Lord. But the Allens were only able to raise $1,100, barely enough to cover his flights and expenses for a week. He's living that life. He's living that allegedly conman life.
I am a grifter, and this is Grifting 101.
But Herkos was broke, and his manager convinced him that any publicity was good publicity, so he flew out to Michigan on the 21st of July, where he told the press that he was there to exorcise the demon from Washtenaw County. Why do the press care? Oh my lord. It's so stupid. Just ignore this stuff. It's pointless, and it's not going to do anything. He was shortly briefed on the 6 murders the police were investigating, and then provided the press with the predictions he'd made so far. According to a report in the Ann Arbor News, quoting, Herkos described the killer as a sick homosexual who gets satisfaction from killing females. We get satisfaction from killing females, does he? I wonder what led you to that conclusion. He said the killer takes the girls to a barn and makes love to the girls. The psychic said he had not been to the barn, but had feelings. Herkos reportedly impressed one of the police officers with his psychic abilities when he placed his hand on a case file and then started describing how the victim's body was found. The police also allowed Herkos to visit the crime scenes, but Herkos claimed that the scenes had grown cold and that he wasn't able to pick up any vibrations from them. He asked for access to the evidence the police had collected, but Prosecutor Deli refused to give him access to the clothes the women had been wearing when they'd died. Miffed, Herkos returned back to his motel, the In America, and then spent the night basking in the attention he got from the locals who were fascinated by the celebrity psychic from Los Angeles. He then spent his time in town sightseeing and talking to his fans, but on his 3rd day in town, Herkos reportedly received a phone call from a man telling him to get out of town before he angered the monster stalking their streets and got fresh blood on his hands. It has been speculated that this never happened and that Herkos used the call to drum up some credibility, but unbeknownst to him, had already met the Ypsilanti River, who wasn't impressed with his so-called psychic abilities and wrote him off as a clown. Wait, that is a huge bit of news. We know who he is then. So far, Emma has not revealed to me that this case gets solved, right? But now we know that he met him. Who did he meet? It must have just been some random person in the public, right? Like one of his fans or some such. Karen Sue Beineman. Karen Sue Beineman was born on the 10th of February 1951 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, to Roland and Marjorie Beineman. She had been dating her childhood sweetheart, James Dwyer, for 5 years at this point and was studying to become a special needs teacher. She had just graduated from high school and signed up for EMU's summer session because it allowed her to choose what dormitory she wanted to live in. She chose to live in Downing Hall, and in a letter to her worried parents, she reassured them that she was more than aware that girls were being murdered, adding that, "Don't worry, I'm careful." On the afternoon of Wednesday, the 23rd of July, Karen and 2 of her new friends had lunch together before they headed off to class, and Karen left to go shopping. Karen had ordered a hairpiece from a shop called Wigs by Joan the previous day and was on her way to pick it up when a young man on a motorcycle asked her if she wanted a ride. Flattered, Karen accepted and got on the back of the motorcycle. They hadn't gone far, just a few blocks, when Karen indicated that they'd reached a destination. The man pulled into the parking lot in front of a chocolate shop, and Karen walked into the wig shop. I'm so careful. Yeah, I just got on a random motorcycle with a dude. The owner of the shop, Diana Gosh, and her assistant, Patricia Spaulding, took out Karen's new hairpiece and showed her how to use it. Karen explained that she'd bought it for a wedding she was going to, and she joked, "I've done 2 things I thought I would never do. One was buy a hairpiece, and the other was to accept a motorcycle ride from a stranger." So careful. Diana and Patricia would later explain that her joke had set their alarm bells ringing. Everyone in town knew that the man responsible for committing the Michigan murders had possibly offered each of his victims a ride, so they did their best to warn Karen about accepting another ride from the dark-haired stranger who was still waiting for outside the store. While Karen was occupied, Diana stepped outside and tried to get a good look at the young man, but instead of meeting her gaze, he dipped his chin and turned his face away. Diana went back into the store and told Karen, "Tell him the wind will mess up your new hairpiece," and offered to give Karen a ride herself. Oh God. But Karen only thanked them for their kind offer, got back onto the motorcycle, and disappeared. Oh, Karen, what the fuck? When Karen missed the 10 p.m. curfew that night, her friends decided to wait until 11 p.m. before they reported her missing. The resident advisor, Verna Perkins, then notified the EMU campus police, the Ypsilanti police, and Karen's parents that she was missing. Roland Beineman then called the Michigan State Police around midnight, and the Ypsilanti police started investigating her disappearance that Thursday morning. Their investigation led them to Wigs by Joan, where Diana and Patricia were able to confirm that they'd seen Karen the previous day. They said that Karen had been wearing a blue and white striped, sleeveless, lightweight top, a pair of cut-off blue jeans, and leather sandals, and they explained that after Karen had left their store, she'd gotten onto the back of a motorcycle with a man she'd never met before. Diana described him as follows. He appeared to be in his early 20s, nice build, about 6 feet tall maybe. He looked clean-cut with short brown hair. When he noticed I was checking him out, he looked away. Patricia explained that the motorcycle looked like a Honda 450 and it had square side mirrors. But Carol Witzera, who worked at the chocolate shop next door, explained that the motorcycle was a blue British-built Triumph that had been juiced up with chrome accessories. She told the investigators that she was a bike enthusiast and hadn't even looked at the guy driving the motorcycle. On Friday morning, a young patrolman named Larry Mathewson attended the morning briefing on Karen's disappearance and told senior police prosecutor Booker Williams that he'd seen someone who matched their suspect's description talking to another young woman the day Karen had disappeared. Officer Mathewson explained that he had played interfraternity football against the suspect the previous year, so Mathewson was sure he'd be able to find out who the guy was. Assistant Prosecutor Williams gave Mathewson the go-ahead to look into it, and an hour later Mathewson had a name: John Norman Collins. John Collins' old fraternity brothers told Officer Mathewson that he'd been kicked out of the fraternity for stealing, but that he was now renting an apartment nearby. Officer Mathewson went to the address, and there he found Collins with a friend working on a group of motorcycles, which included a blue Triumph. Keeping things cool, Officer Mathewson then asked the two men if they'd seen Karen Bamman before, and both of them denied it. He then asked, he's definitely tipping his hand though, isn't he? What? He then asked who the woman was who Collins had been talking to the day Karen had disappeared, and Collins explained that her name was Lorraine Kellogg. Officer Mathewson wrote down the license plates of all 4 motorcycles, then left to question Lorraine. She told him that John Collins was an acquaintance and that several of her friends had dated him at one point, with one of them claiming that Collins was more interested in having sex with them than getting to know them. Lorraine then referred Officer Mathewson to Linda Campbell, another friend of hers that was currently dating Collins. Linda also confirmed that Collins was more interested in his motorcycles than in her, and that he'd often take her on trips along empty roads around town. Then she told Officer Matthews that after the psychic Peter Herkos arrived in town, Collins had been particularly interested in meeting him, but later dismissed him as a clown after talking to him for a few minutes. Well, there we go. It's Collins, isn't it? Locked in because we know he meets him. Quoting her, John said he was hoping to get some inside stuff from the psychic. Herkos didn't discuss the murders, but he was still entertaining to watch. Linda provided Officer Mathewson with a photo of John Collins, and then he went around town asking their witnesses if this was the man they'd seen with Karen Bamman that day. They confirmed that it was, and Officer Mathewson submitted his report that same evening. Okay, we're getting somewhere. We're going to get the guy. That Saturday afternoon, a couple reported that the body of a naked woman was lying at the bottom of a gully not far from the entrance to their driveway. The only thing she had on were leather sandals. Within minutes, Sheriff Douglas Harvey was on the scene and confirmed that the body most probably belonged to the 18-year-old Karen Sue Bamman. Because of severe injuries to her face, she had to be identified using her fingerprints. Dr. Hendricks performed her autopsy and explained that Karen had died 2 to 3 hours after she had last eaten, so between 3 and 4 p.m. on the 23rd of July. Her feet and legs had been bound at one point, and just like the others, she had been savagely beaten, leaving bruises all over her arms, legs, and her body. Her face was so battered that one of her front teeth had been broken above the gum line. Jesus. And Dr. Hendricks explained that despite the savage blows to her head, her cause of death was strangulation. The Ann Arbor News would later report that Karen Sue Bamman met a cruel and lingering death at the hands of a sadistic killer. Now the next bit of glory, but it's necessary, so brace yourselves. At some point during the attack, Karen's killer had shoved a yellow rag into her mouth, and after she'd passed out, he'd burned her skin with acid, possibly ammonia. She'd also been sexually assaulted, and then her underwear had been shoved into her vagina. But inside the underwear was the first piece of real evidence the police had been able to find. 4 tufts of blonde and brown hair, all around an inch long, that had been neatly cut with a clipper instead of scissors. Once again, Dr. Hendricks reported that Karen's body had been moved sometime after her death and had been dumped in the gully just a few hours before it was discovered. Meanwhile, Assistant Prosecutor Williams finally read Officer Mathewson's report on John Norman Collins. Their records showed that they'd interviewed him shortly after Joan Shell's murder. He was the one who'd been taunting his female colleague with the details surrounding what had happened to her. Oh, really? Oh my, wait. So he didn't get it all from the cop people he knew or whatever. So Assistant Prosecutor Williams ruled that John Norman Collins was now suspect number 1. John Norman Collins. The day after Assistant Prosecutor Williams ruled that John Collins was now a suspect, the police started looking more into his background, and they didn't find much. He was born John Norman Chapman on the 17th of June 1947 in Riverside, Ontario, Canada, to Richard and Loretta Chapman. Richard and Loretta had gotten married in 1943, shortly before Richard was sent off to Europe to fight in the war. Richard was an explosions and demolitions expert and had lost his leg during the war. But when he finally returned home, he was no longer the young man that Loretta had married, and military doctors would later diagnose him with battle fatigue, or as we know it today, PTSD. The couple had 3 children together, Jerry, Gail, and John. But when John was a year old, Loretta applied for divorce on the grounds of extreme and repeated cruelty. Her divorce was granted, and she declared that Richard would never see his 3 children again. She would later tell her children that their father had abandoned them. But according to Richard's nephew, John Philip Chapman, quote, "War changes people, and my Uncle Richard and Aunt Loretta were no exceptions. My uncle loved his wife and their children, and was never abusive towards them. Not wanting to put his children at the center of an ugly divorce, Uncle Rich simply left and moved to North Kitchener, Ontario, agreeing to fade into the background." Loretta moved back to the US in 1949, where she and her 3 children moved in with family in Centerline, Detroit. She worked as a waitress to support her young family, and in 1952, Loretta married a local mechanic named William Collins. William officially adopted Loretta's children, and they had their surnames changed to Collins, but Williams was a mean drunk and had no trouble beating the children. Loretta left him in 1965 and divorced him a year later. According to a friend of the family, quoting, "Loretta was able to make ends meet and provide materially for her children, but at a high personal cost. Her work hours conflicted with her home responsibilities, and she was forced to make the same compromises most single working mothers face, not always being home when the kids came home from school. She knew the lifestyle she wanted and worked her butt off as a waitress to get it. She came from nothing and wasn't going to leave Earth that way. She wanted to be somebody with enough money to support her and raise her children. She was so sweet and nice, and always there to help a friend." The 3 Collins children went to the St. Clement Catholic School, and Loretta reportedly brags with just how well her children did in school. John was a good student, was on the honor roll, and was a star athlete. He played football, basketball, and baseball, was on the wrestling team. He was also a good dancer, took pride in his appearance, and was charming and attractive. The Detroit News would later report that John Collins was the embodiment of the all-American boy. In 1965, John Collins went to Central Michigan University on a football scholarship, but soon found out that he wasn't on par with the rest of his teammates. After a year, he transferred to Eastern Michigan University and was studying to become an elementary school teacher. He'd pledged to the Theta Chi fraternity house, played intramural football for Theta Chi, and worked a part-time administrative job in the McKinney Hall building. One of his colleagues, Ken Rowe, would later explain that, quote, "He was a really nice guy, the kind of guy you would let your sister go out with. He was an open and friendly person who had no trouble meeting girls." But shortly after he moved into the Theta Chi house, his fraternity brothers started complaining that things were going missing. Things like golf clubs, hunting rifles, jewelry, and other things that could be sold off without any trouble. Another fraternity brother claimed that John would steal motorbikes and disassemble them in the basement, sell off what parts he could, and dump the frames in dumpsters all over Ypsilanti. Later, some reports would claim that it was well known that he habitually drove around both Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti in stolen cars with a group of young men, and that they would steal whatever they could get their hands on. In 1967, the 20-year-old John was expelled from Theta Chi fraternity house for non-payment of dues and non-attendance of fraternity meetings. John then moved into a boarding house with some friends and had been living there ever since. On the 27th of July, 1969, John Collins returned to the boarding house in Ypsilanti after spending the weekend visiting his mother in Central Line. Not long after, the police showed up on his doorstep and he was taken to the police station for questioning. According to some reports, these officers had missed the memo that explained that John was most likely the killer, so they didn't bring a search warrant. They just took him in for questioning. When John got back, he told his roommate, Arnie Davis, that the police suspected him of killing Karen Bamman. Since thousands of men had been questioned in the past year regarding the murders, Davis didn't think anything of it and told John that they're suspecting a lot of people. The next evening, Davis went with John to his uncle's house. The family were away on vacation and they'd asked John to look after their dog. As he'd done for the past 2 weeks, John opened the garage door, fed the dog, and then returned to the car. Davis waited in the car, and when they got home, John asked him if he could help him unload a few things. John took a knife, wrapped in a shop rag, from under the seat of one of his motorcycles. A short time later, I carried a dark green or blue blanket from the trunk of John's car while he carried a cardboard box to his room. I glanced into the box and saw a pair of women's shoes, some rags or clothing, and a burlap handbag. 15 minutes later, John left the rooming house with the blanket and the box. Within half an hour, he returned home empty-handed. Oh my God. It's like one of those situations where you're like, I'm sure it's innocent, I'm sure nothing weird is happening, but is he murderer? Snowball. The next day, Corporal David Leake and his family returned home after a 2-week-long camping holiday. Their German Shepherd was happy to see them, and when they entered the house, everything was just that they'd left it. Unfortunately so, because Sandra Leake had left a watermelon in the fridge and it was now mushy and disgusting. Sandra's nephew, John, had been feeding their dog while they were away, and Sandra had left him a note on the kitchen counter before they'd left, informing them that he could have the watermelon. The note was still on the kitchen counter and the watermelon was still in the fridge, so Sandra assumed that John hadn't been inside the house and hadn't noticed it. That evening, Sandra was busy sorting out the laundry when she noticed a few scuff marks on the kitchen floor. She'd washed and waxed the floor before they left on holiday, so she knew the marks were new but didn't think much of it. She took the laundry down to the laundry room in the basement, and there she noticed someone had sprayed big patches of black paint on the cement floor. Super creepy and weird, okay. Sandra put the laundry in the washing machine, then went upstairs and asked David if he'd painted the floor, and he said that he hadn't. David followed her back downstairs and told her to see if anything else was out of place, and Sandra told him that a bottle of ammonia and a king-size box of laundry detergent she used as a wastebasket were also missing. Figuring that John must have been in the basement, the Leakes called his apartment, but he didn't answer, so they decided to call him the next day and find out if he'd been in the basement. The next morning, Corporal Leake went to work at the head office of the Michigan State Troopers and was called into the commander's office. There, Post Commander Carl Friedborn told Corporal Leake that his nephew, John Norman Collins, was now the main suspect in Karen Bieneman's murder and that the police had him under surveillance. Alarm bells started going off and Corporal Leake told Commander Friedborn what they'd found, and when they got home the previous evening, Commander Friedborn then updated the team and Corporal Leake was asked to see what else he could find. That night, Sandra told her husband that she hadn't been able to reach John all day, but that she'd left a message for him with Loretta. John called them back at 10:30 p.m., and the Leakes asked him if he'd been in the basement during the last 2 weeks and if he knew anything about the paint. John denied going into the basement and said that he didn't know anything about paint. The next day, a decision was made to send the crime lab technicians to inspect the Leake house, and Corporal Leake went home to break the news to Sandra that John might be a murderer. Hello, dear, just to let you know. A bit of news. Is he painted the floor black to cover up, bloodstains? That's not a brilliant way to deal with it. The State Police Crime Lab arrived at the Leake household at 11 a.m. and started going through the basement with a fine tooth comb. They scraped away the spray paint and discovered rust-colored patches on the cement floor. Corporal Leake told them that it was varnish stains from a DIY project he'd done shortly before they left on vacation, and this was verified by the lab. But along with the varnish stains, the police also found spots of blood on the floor, as well as spots of blood on a boy's shirt that hung on a rail in the laundry room. There were scratch marks and dents on some of the copper pipes, and the police would later theorize that Karen Bieneman had been tied to the pipes before she died. They found a piece of electrical cord that could have been used to tie her up, and underneath the washing machine they found several tufts of blonde-brown hair. Corporal Leake explained that Sandra had cut their boy's hair before they went on vacation. She always did in the laundry room, and some of the hair must have ended up underneath the washing machine. Then the police had to explain the significance of the hair, and Sandra spent the rest of the day crying in their bedroom. A day later, on the 1st of August 1969, John Norman Collins was officially arrested for the murder of Karen Sue Bieneman, and Loretta Collins would always resent her sister for accusing her son of being a murderer. Yeah, but he fucking was. Oh my god, I get it, but also he was. He was. Good for you. Good for you, ratting on your sister's kid. But seriously, he would have murdered more people. The Californian Connection. John Norman Collins' arrest made national news, and on the 2nd of August 1969, Robert L. Taylor, the district attorney for Monterey County in Salinas, California, was watching the news coverage of the Michigan murders on his television. And as the news anchor detailed John Collins' crimes, D.A. Taylor realized that the murder of Karen Sue Bieneman sounded oddly similar to a recent murder that the police in Salinas were busy investigating. 17-year-old Roxy Ann Phillips was born on the 21st of March 1952 in New Mexico and grew up in Milwaukee, Oregon. She was visiting the Kunis family in Salinas for the summer, and on the afternoon of the 30th of June 1969, she told Mrs. Kunis that she was quickly going out to mail a letter home and visit a friend of hers, Nancy Albrecht. When Rosie didn't return home by 6 p.m. that evening, Mrs. Kunis reported her as missing, fully aware that 2 other teenage girls had been murdered in recent weeks. The police searched for 2 weeks before someone discovered Roxy's body at the bottom of a canyon. Just like Karen C. Bieneman, Roxy was naked apart from the sandals on her feet. She'd been strangled with her own belt, and her body had been dumped sometime after her death. When the police interviewed her friends, Nancy, she explained that Roxy never made it to her house that afternoon. Nancy also told investigators that they hadn't planned to get together since Nancy had a date that afternoon with John from Michigan. According to Nancy, she'd been walking to her house the previous afternoon when a car pulled up alongside her. The young man introduced himself and asked for directions. He told her that he and a friend had just moved to Salinas and that they'd towed a trailer all the way from Michigan. Nancy said that the man was tall and blonde, in his early 20s, and had short brown hair. He wore Levi jeans and a t-shirt and was driving a flashy silver car. The two of them arranged for a date the next afternoon, but he never showed up. The police theorized that John from Michigan might have been on his way to Nancy's house when he saw Roxy walking along the street and found her to be an easier target. Acting on a hunch that John from Michigan and the 22-year-old John Collins from Michigan might be the same guy, D.A. Taylor called the authorities in Washtenaw County and told them that the two cases might be linked. With their help, the Salinas police were able to find out that John Collins and a friend named Andrew Manuel had rented a house trailer in June 1969. The trailer was never returned. The Salinas police found the trailer parked behind the house of the Manuel family in Salinas. Silver Manuel told the police that his grandson Andrew and his friend John had showed up at the end of June with the trailer and had then just abandoned it in an alley behind their house. Andrew Manuel didn't even have the decency to say goodbye to his 80-year-old grandfather before he and John skipped town a few days later. The police inspected every inch of the trailer and found nothing. It had been thoroughly cleaned and wiped down so that not even a partial fingerprint could link it to either John Collins or Andrew Manuel. But the task force in Michigan was able to provide the Salinas police with the registration number for a silver Oldsmobile Cutlass that John Collins had been driving at the time, and they determined that it had the car serviced at a shop in Salinas on the 3rd of July. The employees confirmed that the car had a trailer hitch attached to it at the time, but that they'd been asked to remove it. Then one of the officers who'd inspected the site where Roxy's body had been left reported that it had a bad reaction to some poison oak and that grew in the area where her body was found. The police questioned every doctor in Salinas, and one reported that yes, a man named John Collins had come to see him to treat a rash that he'd sustained from coming into contact with poison oak. The Michigan State Police reported that they'd found typo bloodstains on the seatbelt of the Cutlass, as well as a piece of red fabric under the driver's seat that matched the clothes Roxy had been wearing when she disappeared. Everything's just getting wrapped up now, isn't it? It's just every case is just all being tied together. And maybe this guy's going to get the death penalty. Woo! Even better, during a search of John Collins' bedroom, they found a brown sweater that had pubic hair embedded in the yarn on one of the shoulders. Comparisons to Roxy's pubic hair were done, and they were determined to be a likely match. On the 29th of September 1969, a grand jury indicted John Norman Collins for the murder of Roxy Ann Phillips, and the Michigan authorities were more convinced than ever that they'd finally captured the monster who'd been stalking their streets for the past 2 years. The original co-ed killer. I'm not going to discuss John Norman Collins' trial in detail. Honestly, the most interesting part was learning the scientific methods they used to determine whether the hair they'd found stuffed into Karen Bieneman's mouth matched the hair found underneath the washing machine. According to Washtenaw County prosecutor William Delhey, they were only able to link John Collins to Karen Bieneman's murder, so while they prepared for his murder trial, the other cases were put aside. The trial started on the 2nd of June 1970 and lasted until the 14th of August 1970, becoming the longest murder trial in Michigan history at the time. On the 19th of August, the jury found that John Norman Collins was guilty of the first-degree murder of Karen Sue Bieneman. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole at the age of 23, and both his subsequent appeals failed. Good. I mean, he didn't get the death penalty, but, life without parole is pretty good. Initially, Senator Ronald Reagan had insisted that John Collins should be extradited to California so that he could face justice for the murder of Roxy Ann Phillips. His lawyers knew that the evidence against him was watertight, and if he was found guilty of her murder, he would be sentenced to death. They managed to convince the Californian lawmakers that John Collins had a right to appeal his sentence first, and that decision could be made afterwards. By 1972, the public's attention had shifted, and the pending extradition order was waived. That's a shame. They could have taken him and got him over to California and stuck a needle in his arm, or strapped him in a chair, or whatever they did back in the day. Gassed him, shot him, whatever. Yay! Despite trying to escape from prison twice, John Norman Collins is still in prison and has been mostly forgotten by the true crime community. This is because when John Collins' trial started in 1970, the national and international media were focusing all of their attention on the trial of the Manson family. As a result, the man known as the co-ed killer, the Michigan murderer, the Ypsilanti killer, and the Ypsilanti ripper faded into obscurity mere months after his sentencing. It's fair to say that no one really remembers John Norman Collins, but this also means no one remembers the names or the stories of the 8 women who are known only as the victims of the Michigan murders. So I'm going to take a page out of Matt Grander's book, another one of the writers on this channel, and end today's script by remembering who they were. Mary Flar, Joan Schell, Jane Mixer, Marilyn Skelton, Dawn Bassam, Alice Colom, Karen Sue Bieneman, and Roxy Ann Phillips. Finally, today dismembered appendices. Number 1. Some of the podcasts I listened to explain that Peter Hochhaus somehow managed to accurately predict that the Ypsilanti Ripper had short, dark hair, was between the ages of 20 and 23, and rode a motorcycle just days before John Collins was arrested. I wasn't able to find any references to his prediction in the newspaper reports, but in his book, Terror in Ypsilanti, John Collins Unmasked, author Gregory A. Fournier points out that Assistant Prosecutor Williams told him that Peter Hochhaus was present in the room when the officers were briefed on their suspect's appearance following the discovery of Karen Bieneman's body. Apparently, he was throwing a fit because they didn't want to take him to the site where a body was found. He left town the same day. Fraud, allegedly. Number 2. Following the discovery of Karen Bieneman's body, Washtenaw County Sheriff Douglas Harvey planned to set a trap for the killer. Once the crime scene technicians were done with the scene, the police borrowed a mannequin from a J.C. Penney's and left it in the ditch. 9 police officers were a part of the stakeout and reportedly spent most of the night complaining over the radio that the mosquitoes were having them for dinner. When an unknown man came jogging past the scene at midnight, the officer who saw him couldn't even report it because the batteries on their radios had died. During the murder trial, the defense tried to use this to their advantage by implicating the police had allowed the real killer to get away, since at the time, John Collins was at his mother's house in Central Line. Number 3. Washtenaw County Sheriff Douglas Harvey is described as an axe now, ask questions later law and order sheriff, and he became sheriff when he was just 32 years old. After he was appointed, the county jail became known as Harvey's Hotel, and any long-haired hippies who found themselves spending the night there left the hotel with a new hairdo. Apparently, some of them complained that the man who cut their hair was a convicted murderer, so Sheriff Harvey hired a professional barber to cut their hair in the future, claiming that it was an attempt to prevent a lice infestation. Okay. Number 4. After John's arrest, Loretta found him a respected lawyer and took out a second mortgage to pay for his defense. She attended every hearing and reportedly broke off all contact with her sister Sandra Leake for betraying the family. Your son is a murderer, mate. Like, come on. John Collins allegedly admitted his crimes to his mother shortly after he was sent to prison, and then she broke off all contact with him. When Loretta passed away, she didn't leave him anything in her will as punishment, explaining that he knows what he did. I mean, not that he's going to be able to use it. He's in prison. It's like, I left your house. It's like, you're never going to be able to use it because you're going to die in prison where you belong. 5. For those who might be interested, the forensic scientists at the time chemically analysed the 5,000 hairs found in Karen Bieneman's body to determine if they were a match to the hair found underneath the washing machine. The levels of chemicals found in the separate samples were then compared to each other to determine a match. They also compared the hair underneath the microscope to see if they were similar. Number 6. In 2004, DNA found on Jane Mix's clothes identified the 62-year-old Gary Earl Leiterman as her killer. Back in 1969, he was a traveling salesman living in Kalamazoo and was later arrested for issuing fake prescriptions. He was convicted and sentenced for life imprisonment in August 2005, while Jane's 90-year-old father, Daniel Mixer, looked on. Alex Colom was the only victim who could be linked to John Collins based on DNA evidence. And finally, number 7, the University of Michigan School of Art and Design, aka Stamps, hosts an annual undergrad jury exhibition for promising artists, and one of the awards they give away is the Alice Elizabeth Colom Award. It's awarded to students who demonstrate excellence in photography in memory of Alice Colom. And that's where we end today's episode. If you find the show interesting, please do leave it a review or a rating on Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. If you're listening on YouTube, watching on YouTube even, like and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.